Hi guys, it's Sidney Galpern from simicakes.com here today with another tutorial. Today I am going to show you one of my most highly requested video tutorials, which is blowing an isomalt bubble. Blown isomalt and blown sugar is a really cool and fun technique to learn, so today I thought we would start with the basics of blowing a bubble, but once you master that, you can really apply that to make all different kinds of shapes and designs. For this technique, we start with pulled isomalt. Now, I have a whole nother video on my YouTube channel that I will link in the description of this video to pulling isomalt. So if you haven't done it before, definitely go and watch that. It has all the information, it's super in-depth. But basically, we're just pouring our isomalt out onto the mat and folding it to cool it down until it becomes a clay. I'm using a beautiful light blue isomalt for this today. Lighter colors are always going to be easier when working with blown isomalt than darker. Just like with fondant and gum paste, the more color that's mixed into the isomalt is going to affect the texture. So it's always going to be easiest to start with lighter colors, and even clear is going to be the absolute easiest to use, and then work up to making darker colored bubbles. Remember, isomalt can also be painted in airbrush, so you could make everything in a clear or a base color and then just paint them later if you wanted to. Lighter colors are also easier because you can see the air inside the bubble and you can see where it's going and which side is going to be inflating more than the other, rather than just relying on the shape and the size itself. Now remember, isomalt is very, very hot. It's about 300 degrees, so you don't want to touch it. I highly recommend wearing gloves whenever working with isomalt to protect your hands. So this is my sugar pump that I'm going to be using today. So you can see this is my design. It's from simicakes.com, of course. And so this actually has already been seasoned. So what I mean by that is on the end of the pump, I always season the metal tip, and that is going to help the isomalt stick on really, really well so that it doesn't leak out any air as you're trying to pump, and it also doesn't fly across the room when you start pumping. That's very important. So I also have another tutorial on my YouTube channel of how to season the end, super in-depth, but basically I just put some cuts in it with the scissors and then dip it in liquid isomalt. Now the pump does not come like this. This is my personal preference just because I think it makes it a lot easier. I'm right-handed, so I like to use my right hand to hold the pump, and then I hold the pipe in my left hand. That way I can go back and forth with my right hand from pumping it to shaping it. I always hold the pipe straight up and down when I'm doing blown isomalt. That's because you kind of have to work with gravity, so if you're holding it off to the side or if it's at an angle, gravity's going to be pulling that bubble down. By holding it straight up and down, it gives you the easiest time shaping it. You can even sometimes hold it upside down if you feel like gravity will help assist in the shape that you're going for. First things first, before we start blowing our bubble, we always make sure that the pipe is clear and open. So you can pump it and you can feel the air coming out. You don't feel any resistance. It's just pumping super nice and clean. That way you know that there's no isomalt stuck down in it from the last time that you used it that's going to be obstructing the airflow. Once the isomalt is pulled and ready, I'm just going to set it underneath the heat lamp for a second, and I'm going to heat up the end of my pipe to get it nice and sticky so that the isomalt attaches. I'll roll my isomalt into a ball and then insert the pipe about 1/3 of the way into the ball of isomalt, just slightly less than half. That way the air is going to be blown directly into the center. You want to pinch all the way down around the base where the pipe is to really secure the isomalt onto the pump so that no air leaks out. Then you can use your hand to lightly reshape it into a sphere. Don't worry about what the base of it looks like right now because that's all going to be trimmed away once we take the bubble off. So now that the isomalt is sealed onto the end of my pipe, I'm going to start pumping, but you don't want to pump too much at once. You just want to do a little bit at a time because the slower you go with this, the more control you have to make it perfect. So all I'm going to do is give it one pump and then wait. So I'm just kind of lightly shaping it to make sure it's nice and round. It doesn't have to be perfect at this point. And I'm going to start pumping. So one pump and then stop. It's not going to look like anything's happening at first, but I promise it is. What's happening is the pressure is building up in the pipe, and it's going to go very, very slowly because the isomalt is so thick. So you only want to give it one pump at a time and then give it about 10 seconds or so before you add any more air to see when the bubble goes into the isomalt. So one pump and then wait. So I'm pumping as hard as I can until I feel resistance, and then I stop. There it goes. So I could see that itty bitty little puff of air go in, and it's not going to be much, and sometimes it takes longer. It depends on the texture of your isomalt when you pull it and if it's thicker or if it's softer depending on how much air you put in it. But once I see that little puff, I'm just going to continue shaping it into a nice sphere, Now when I pump, I don't want to give it an entire pump all at once. From here on out, we only do itty bitty little pumps, just enough to see it get bigger, so only a little bit at a time. That way if the air starts to go off to one side, we can control it and keep it nice and round. So I can see that the air on my bubble is all going kind of to one spot here. So that just means that this is a warm spot. So if you have a warmer spot on your bubble, a hot spot, it's going to be softer there and easier for the air to inflate. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cool that down by pressing it into a cool surface, and that will just solidify that spot a little bit more so that it balances out the temperature and balances out the texture. So by just pressing it onto a cool surface and then inflating a little bit more air. And don't be afraid to use your hand to really sculpt it and move it around and push it in the direction that you want to keep it nice and round. Now before this gets too blown and too thin, I'm going to start stretching it at the base, and that is just going to create a spot for me to cut, because at first when the pipe is inside the bubble, when you're ready to cut it off, you can't really cut through that pipe, right? So what I'm going to do is just slide my fingers up at the base. So I'm going right underneath where the bubble would naturally curve, and I'm just rolling and pushing my fingers upwards, and that is going to stretch out a nice stem. So from the bottom of the bubble where it would naturally curve to the top of the pipe that I can see through my isomalt and see that little end, that I want a ½ inch to an inch of space, and that is going to be perfect to cut it off at the end once I'm ready. But as I'm stretching the stem, I want to make sure I'm not pressing it closed, because you still want that airflow to be able to pump. So I'm only going in an upwards direction and rolling my fingers up, but I'm not actually compressing it closed. Now it's very important throughout this entire process, the texture of the isomalt. If you put the isomalt on the end of your pump, and from that point throughout the entire piece, if you notice that your bubble is immediately just falling over or slumping or deflating, that means that the isomalt is way too warm. It has not been pulled enough and does not have enough air in it to hold its shape. So if you find that your isomalt is just immediately collapsing, then you want to take it off, re-pull it, add a little bit more air in, and then put it back on so that it holds its shape. Now, knowing how big to make these does take a little bit of practice, a little bit of trial and error, but basically I just like to keep inflating it until it is the size that I want, until it's nice and even, and I don't see any areas that are thicker or that look a little bit off. So the more that you pump this, the more and more blown out it's going to be, and the thinner the walls are as well. So you can control that if you want thinner and more delicate bubbles, or if you want them to have a little bit more strength to them. If you want bigger bubbles, the trick is to start with a bigger piece of isomalt to begin with. Bigger bubbles are actually easier, in my opinion, than smaller bubbles because they hold a lot more heat, so you have more time to work with them. So I would say if you are just starting out with blown isomalt, to start a little bit bigger, more like the size that I'm doing here, and then work your way smaller as you get more practice. There's always going to be those air bubbles and those beautiful streaks and that satin finish of the air from the pulled sugar mixed into the isomalt. The key to getting crystal clear bubbles is to actually use casting, where you can get all of the air out. So pouring into molds rather than blowing, because blown bubbles always have that beautiful shine from all of the air mixed in. I'm constantly looking at my bubble from every angle and direction, and that is just to keep it nice and consistent so that it doesn't look perfect from one side, but then you turn it around and it's got it done. Okay, so I think I am happy with how my bubble is looking. It looks very even, it looks nice and consistent, so I'm going to go ahead and stop pumping and shaping it now. As it starts to cool, you don't want to keep continuing to try and put air into it and shaping it, because as it gets cooler, it gets harder, and you don't want to risk popping or shattering these. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop, and I'm going to cool it using my little fan. So by cooling it off with the fan, it's just going to freeze this whole thing in place. You always want to make sure the entire bubble is cool and hard so that when you take it off, it doesn't deflate. If it's too soft and warm, it's just going to collapse. The bubble doesn't necessarily have to be cold at this point. You just want it so that it's completely solid and you can't bend it or put any indents in it with your fingers. I'm just going to heat the bubble right up against where it would naturally curve, and I'm going to cut through using my scissors, cutting little bits all the way around to keep the base nice and round. You can always torch more if it doesn't cut through right away. Sometimes you have to build up the heat to get all the way down to the center. The bottom of the bubble should close over when you cut it off, but you can also very carefully lightly reheat the bubble from the side, not pointing the torch directly at it, and then smooth it over using your silicone mat. I don't worry too much about what the bottom of the bubble looks like because that is where I will dip it in liquid Isomalt and stick it directly to my fondant cake, to my Isomalt sculpture, or whatever I am using it for. When you're ready to clean off the end of the pipe to do another bubble, all you're going to do is heat the entire piece of Isomalt that's stuck to the pipe until it's soft. You don't want it dripping because if it's dripping and heated that much from the torch, it's going to be burnt. So just get it so the entire thing is soft, and then you're going to place your scissors parallel to the pipe, sink them in, but don't go through all the way, just pry off the Isomalt. A little bit is still going to be stuck to the pipe, but that's good because it is going to stick for your next bubble as long as the end of the pipe is nice and open so the air can get through. I like to do this over my bowl of Isomalt so it catches all of the scraps and I can remelt them. And then you're ready for another bubble. And don't forget to spray all of your finished pieces with the clear edible glaze spray to keep them from getting sticky or cloudy. If I had to pick one top tip for working with Isomalt, it's practice. Remember that practice makes perfect, so doing it over and over again is going to give you better and better results every single time. So that works perfect with Isomalt because luckily with Isomalt you can remelt it as many times as you want. So you can practice over and over again using the same Isomalt and perfect your skills. Even if something happens in the middle of making your bubble and you get a big dent in it or it gets lopsided, don't stop and start over because the more that you do this, the better and better it gets. So if you stop at step 5 of a 10-step process, you're not going to know what to do for those next 5 steps that you didn't get to do yet. So if you go through all of the steps with something that you don't necessarily care if it comes out perfect, it's purely just for practice, the next one is going to be even better. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me through email or Instagram, Facebook, all of that. I will be happy to respond. And make sure to tag me in pictures too when you make your own blown Isomalt bubbles because I would love to see them. Till next time, keep life sweet.